Thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. It's a small but enthusiastic group. And since the weather is terrible, we really do appreciate everybody coming out on such a night. So I want to thank Peter and Carla and Beth for being here from the East Side Freedom Library and hosting us tonight. It's a treat to be here in this beautiful space. One of our 3 Carnegie libraries in St. Paul. So I always love coming over here because I just love this library. Our History Revealed programs are sponsored by our venues, which very kindly let us have our programs, as well as our members. So I know there's a couple members here today. We do appreciate all of our membership support, and if you'd like to be a member, you not only can support these programs, but you get our quarterly magazine. There's some copies in the back of the back table if you'd like to see it. Feel free to take one of those with you. There's one that is literally hot off the presses. It just came today. So membership, you get our magazine. You also get free admission to our historic site, which is Gibbs Farm up on Larpenteur in Cleveland. And it's a pioneer and Dakota interpretive site, and it's great this summer. It's closed right now, but we'll be starting up at the end of May, Memorial Day weekend, whose date I just forgot. But it'll be going from Memorial Day weekend through the end of October. So not only do you get free admission as a member, you get 10% off day camps, you get 10% off of all our books and so forth. So please consider joining if you haven't already. Our next program for our History Revealed is this week. Hopefully we won't get ice or something. It's going to be this Thursday, March 14th at 7:45 at Waldman's Brewery, which is over off of Smith Street. It's a really fun tap room and brewery. They've got great food. So feel free to join us over there. Andrea Swenson will be talking about her new book, Got to Be Something Here, where she investigates the artists and the music scene and all of the venues and so forth from the 1970s, 80s, and so forth. So that not only covers Prince, but it covers a lot of the other artists who were around. Minneapolis was a hot scene then, so she'll be talking about her new book, Got to Be Something Here. If you need directions or anything, see me after the program. And if you'd like to learn about more of our upcoming programs, they're on our website, www.rchs.com, or feel free to sign up on the back table where the books are, and I'll put you on our mailing list, because we send out email reminders. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Elizabeth Duclos-Orsello, and I hope I'm saying that right. Perfect. Is a professor and chair of interdisciplinary studies and the coordinator of the American Studies at Salem State University, and she kindly flew in on Sunday to talk to us. And Elizabeth.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I think I'm going to sit. We've got a sort of planned a podium situation. I'm usually pretty informal, but I planned a podium situation, and so we're sort of switching things up here because I am gonna read remarks, but I tend to go off. My prepared remarks more often than not, so I'll try to keep myself in the lane. Since we have such an intimate group, if there's something you want to know more about, even in process, just shout it out. But I understand we have until 8:30. Is that true?
Whatever you need.
Okay. So my plan is to have time for conversation afterwards, but if there's something that comes up along the way, please just ask. And I want to first start off thanking the folks at the Ramsey County Historical Society and also here at the Eastside Freedom Library. When we were coordinating this event, I actually was just thrilled to be able to bring together two organizations that suit the work that I do and also just how I live my life. So you have one organization that is interested in and committed to trying to recover and interpret the past, and another that is interested in trying to celebrate the present and link the present and the past in ways that are attached to social justice initiatives and movements, and that is very much what this book is about. And so I cannot think of a better place to have this event, and to be in a Carnegie Library to boot is pretty spectacular. I also, because I'll embarrass them now, so I won't even embarrass them later, but I do want to thank my in-laws and my sister-in-law who are here, who came out from out of town to come here. And I'm not quite sure what you will think of all this, but you've heard me talk about it for years. So thank you guys for being here. This is a bit of a homecoming for me. I used to live here in St. Paul, and for years have been back and forth working on this project, and it's just always a pleasure to be here. So, I'm here to talk about this new book in which I position the everyday activities of average folks, average St. Paulites from a century ago at the center of what I think is a critical story, a critical untold story in US history, and also a critical shift in US history, which is the remaking of what we talk about when we talk about community. I am an interdisciplinary scholar. I play fast and loose across the arts, the humanities, and the social sciences. Makes me great at parties, always a little bit on the edge of any singular academic conference, but it's work that I think is important. And this interdisciplinary look that I've taken at the contested meanings of community that emerged here in St. Paul is a study that does a few things. One, I was hoping to take up for the first time in 40 years a sustained scholarly look at the concept of community. I wanted to offer a new synthesis for the activities and the agendas and the efforts of the opening 2 decades of the 20th century, which I think are problematically termed the progressive era. And so I was trying to synthesize a whole host of things that, and integrate social, cultural, economic, and political histories together. The book tries to make sense of the complex everyday activities that gave birth to modern America, that I believe are still shaping our lives now in the postmodern, if we will. And the book tries to position St. Paul as a city whose history has implications for our understanding of US history writ large. Finally, the book is bookended, literally bookended, introduction and conclusion, by some ideas and some reflections on the ways in which a set of ideas that came into being a century ago might animate our lives in the here and now around social justice and equity issues. The work is rooted in my interdisciplinary scholarship, but also in my social justice avocation. And it's historical in focus, but historical for a very particular reason. Come on in, the water's fine.
Excuse me.
Because we can't change the world in the here and now if we don't know how we got here. So I ask in the book for people to take seriously the ways in which our everyday actions, activities, and cultural production and decisions, both personally and collectively, either include or exclude fellow human beings around issues of race, class, ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and other identity markers within geographic areas that we still often refer to as our communities. So, I'm going to frame this talk, I'll explain in a moment what I'm going to do with the talk, but I'm really interested in what do we talk about when we talk about community and why, through what mechanisms and to what ends Americans have maintained or challenged a particular understanding of the concept. How did everyday residents of one US city 100 years ago remake the idea of community, transform it from something that had been to something new that we would recognize today? And what are the implications for that remaking in 2019? Various chapters in the book take up park planning, photography, the Winter Carnivals, St. Paul architecture, and Sinclair Lewis's novel Main Street as a piece of popular fiction, in which St. Paul plays a critical role. I argue that community was redefined through these cultural products, and focusing on St. Paul allows us to look at that remaking at a level of nuance and granularity that is not so possible when you look at a larger city. So I'm going to give you a broad sweep through the book's major claims, a little of a highlights tour, and then I'm going to dive a little deeper into 2 sections of the book, particularly family photographs and the St. Paul Winter Carnivals of 1916 and 1917. So, with not much further ado, can we just hit the next slide there? So, I want to start off pretty big. And I've got a bunch of images up here that reflect different ways that people talk about community in 2019. And I just ask you to take a look at that array. I just make a mental note for yourself which of these resonate with you if I were to say the word community and say stick the word community on one or more of these images. Most people in the room would attach that word to more than one. You might think, oh, the global community, or community is something that has to do with, sort of volunteerism, a Habitat for Humanity build, perhaps, or here we have a girls' basketball team, or we have civil rights activists in the far left corner there. We have a space, a religious space, we have an urban space, we have a small Mediterranean village, and we have sort of this quintessential New England scene. You can flip to the next slide. So here, on this slide, are some, just a smidgen, of the 4 billion hits that you get if you do, thank you, a Google search for community. Try it at home. Do a Google search for community and you get more than 4 billion hits. And these are just a random selection. Community in 2019 seems to be used to mean nearly anything. And in the years since I started thinking about this project, and really the question that spurred this project was how and why did we get to a place where community could mean so many different things. The term is omnipresent in our global transnational world in the 20th century. It appears in social media posts, corporate mailings, headlines, coffee shop boards, church bulletins, and on and on and on. And yet, if you ask 100 people to define community, you'll get more than 100 answers. If you challenge your friends and family to talk about what is their community or what are their communities, very quickly the conversation gets complicated. And it usually ends up moving far beyond where it started. It is used to refer to lifelong friendship groups, to neighborhood gatherings, transnational networks, people living in diaspora, online tweets of those who follow a particular Netflix show, and more. It's at once meaningless and it's incredibly meaningful. It can mean a connection with people that you see every day or people that you will never actually meet in person. It can be linked to a place, to a belief, to an action, to an interest. It's suitable for a knitting group and a gathering of activists. It's been appropriated by sports fans and block party organizers, by nations, faith traditions, elementary schools, and groups based on nearly every imaginable combination of demographic characteristics and interests and geographic boundaries. The one common denominator is that community always has a positive connotation. If somebody can come up with an example that is not that, please tell me. I want to figure out what that is. It's endowed with this sort of unwavering positive energy, even though it's not endowed with a whole lot of clear boundaries. But problematically, the term, right, in its expansiveness, it does not discriminate, even though groups who use it might. It is also wholly compatible, not only with, in the past, the logic of industrial capitalism, but in the present, with the logics of neoliberalism. And as I often say, it can absolve a whole lot of sins. Throw the word community out in a setting, and all of a sudden, there's a sense that you can wipe away a whole lot of division or anxiety. So when I started thinking about this and started to be bothered, this is the itchy question, the itchy thing that I noticed like 2 decades ago, and it just started irritating me. And I just kept thinking, how did we get to this place? How did we get to this place? How did we get to this place? This seems a little odd. And my search for how did we come to this expansiveness of the term led me back about 100 years ago to a previous moment of incredible change, one that actually I think would be more familiar to many of us than we like to think. If we could transport ourselves in this city back 100 years ago, some of the questions, the concerns, the challenges, the everyday lives that we would be living would have more resonances than we might expect. So it led me back 100 years, and it led me back to cities, to the booming, changing cities of a century ago. For early 20th century Americans, the term and the concept of community had become incredibly ambiguous as a concept. It was increasingly tied to both place and to a whole host of other conceptualizations. And in the book, I demonstrate how and why people in this particular urban space helped reorient Americans' understanding of what it would be and how it would be understood. Their concerns and their reactions to changing demographics, changing economic conditions were sometimes were completely accidental, sometimes incredibly intentional. But these everyday actions were the catalysts for this profound reorientation. So, why study community? Well, I mentioned before, I mentioned in passing, but again, when I started to I thought, oh, someone else must have written on this, right? I'll just go, there it is. The historiography is probably, full of this stuff. Somebody's done this work. But what became clear to me, and increasingly in the last 5 years or so, I had started working on this a couple decades ago in a totally different form. I started asking the question, put the project away, and about 4 years ago, I realized that I kept waiting for somebody to write a book on this topic, and nobody had. And I thought, well, this is a problem, because in those intervening 2 decades, a whole lot of big concepts have been taken up by scholars and problematized. Things like nation, whiteness, gender, race, right? Terms that had previously been used as though they were fixed and they were known, scholars have started to interrogate them and figure out how we've come to these conceptualizations so that we can use these terms in a more nuanced way. And community is this huge term that nobody has taken up. Thomas Bender wrote a book about 40 years ago where he tried to do this, but his book ended about 1890. He sort of stopped talking about how the concept has shifted in about 1890. So there we were. If anybody's ever wondering how you come upon a project, sometimes it's just because there's a silence. And you're irritated enough by the silence that you decide to try to answer it yourself. I also was fascinated by the fact that most intellectuals, sort of public intellectuals and scholars and activists of the early 20th century were talking about community all the time in their own writings. So the fact that it actually hadn't been problematized by scholars, contemporary scholars, seemed really, really odd. So I'm going to talk a lot about what shifted between, let's say, 1900 and 1920, but just so we're oriented in the same space, right? To talk about the change, you need to understand what was. So what was an understanding of community in the 19th century was that community, and I'm really just giving you the shorthand here, community was generally linked to some aspect of emotional connection or care, and also to a notion of political and civic life that were themselves tied to places of residence. All of that was sort of packed into one package. The earlier understanding believed that location mattered, where you lived mattered. But in addition, that wasn't good enough. You also had to have this humanistic, reciprocal kind of connection with those people. There needed to be a deeper resonance. It couldn't just be instrumental. The reason this was possible in the 19th century was that in the 19th century, most Americans were living in small geographic areas, cities and towns, small towns, small villages, rural areas. And you were generally living in those places with people who were very much like you. They were like you largely and most often in their racial identifiers, in their ethnic or place of origin, their languages that they spoke, your religious affiliations. So you could have this conception of community that wrapped up, oh, the people that I like and I care about, who I also live near and with, oh, and we also all happen to be the same, right? And what happens, so that the homogeneity, right, the sameness of those places allowed people to have a conception that in theory could encompass a lot of different ideas, but in practice was like, I live in a place with these people, we all get along, I love them, they love me, maybe we have fights, but we all are looking out for each other. And that worked until the United States started shifting and changing really, really, really fast. And started changing really, really, really fast in places like St. Paul. So if we can shift, okay, we can, forgot that slide was even there. We can go to the next one. And you can go to the next one as well. Sorry, this is when I didn't, there we go. So this is for those who want the 30-second version of what happened between like 1890 and 1920, is that pretty much everything that had marked sort of typical experiences of life in the United States shifted. The nation was in motion. Cities in particular were changing at breakneck speed. In 1920, the 1920 census was the first census in which more than 50% of the American public now lived in cities. So prior to 1920, most people lived in non-urban areas. 1920, more Americans than not lived in urban areas, and that's never changed since. But what that means is there was a dramatic movement, series of moves. The three big markers that we talk about are, when we talk about this period of time, are urbanization, and then migrations, both international migrations, which we refer to usually as immigration, and then domestic migrations, so people moving around the United States, and industrialization, and they all went hand in hand. With industrialization, you needed people to work low-wage factory jobs to keep those things going, therefore you needed bodies. Okay, that was a pull factor to the United States that moved people through migration, and as a result, people had to live in cities and urban areas because that's where they had jobs. So these three things are interwoven. But the whole country was in motion, right? Trains were crisscrossing the nation in greater number than they ever had. Machinery was humming and clanking and doing steaming and all these things in all these factories. People were weaving and stitching and smelting in factories across the country. Migrants from around the world arrived at Ellis Island and Angel Islands and then headed inland. Others recrossed and recrossed borders both north and south. Sharecropping families were heading north out of the south in what became known as the Great Migration. Even things like films, right? You start to have movies. These are actually moving pictures, right? Even your entertainment is in motion. And you have artists. This is one example from the Ashcan School. New urban-based artists in the United States who are taking impressionist ideas from Europe and applying them to trying to paint urban scenes with these fast brushstrokes and sort of flickering imagery. We can go to the next slide here. So the movements of all these people and the rise of cities, the ascendancy of industrial wage labor, immigration, mass culture, right? The emergence of national and international markets on a larger scale than ever before profoundly transformed the United States, and increasingly and profoundly transformed cities, which are now where more people were living than ever before. Diversity was the name of the game in terms of people's lived experiences coming together in places in ways that they had never been in places together before. And all this movement and all this change caused a fair amount of anxiety, particularly among native-born American academics, religious leaders, business people, municipal and national leaders. Because people were going from a notion of what American life was that's sort of captured over here in this lovely lithograph of small town village life to this, my actually favorite American painting ever, which is George Bellows' Cliff Dwellers, which is a scene from New York City, but it's capturing what urban spaces were like. And in between, you get a lot of scholars and intellectuals who start to freak out. And Edward Ross, whose quote is here, Edward Ross wrote a book in 1901, so the beginning of the time I'm interested in which he wrote, "In cities, powerful forces are more and more transforming community into society. That is, replacing living tissue with structures held together with rivets and screws." These people were terrified about many things that were happening to change. They were concerned about what it was going to mean to be American. They were concerned about whether their country was going to be altered by these people. But they were also concerned about the loss of community that they saw happening, or they believed was going to happen in cities. Because in cities, you could not have the kind of experiences where you knew everyone in the same intimate reciprocal way that you actually lived with, and you couldn't be assured that you all shared any other number of similarities, given the diversity of the city itself. Edward Ross was buddies with Teddy Roosevelt. Just FYI, Teddy Roosevelt wrote the preface for the first edition of this book, and it's a whole other project. I'd love somebody to dive into that. So they had all this anxiety. But at the same time, folks who had grown up in places like that and were white, native-born, middle and upper class academics, intellectuals, and leaders were unwilling to get rid of the idea of community altogether. They actually were wedded to the concept, and they were seeking ways to make it make sense. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. You can go to the next slide. You don't need to read this. I'll just talk to you about it. What they end up doing, what ends up happening is that the intellectual crowd, and you see this isn't just out of people, there are a lot of people, particularly the Chicago School, John Dewey, Robert Park, and Jane Addams are doing a lot of writing on this in Chicago, and then in Boston, people like Mary Parker Follett are doing a lot of writing on this, and what you see by the end of the 19-teens is actually people are writing about the term community, but they're using the term in much more expansive ways. They don't give up on the term, they just expand the types of relationships and the types of experiences that it can capture. So you start to see it talked about in a whole range of ways that it hadn't been before. Edward Ross is saying that in cities, community is, cities are replacing living tissue with structures held together by rivets and screws. By 1917, Robert McIver, who's another leading sociologist, is writing, all community is a question of degree. While community might be the label given to a city or town, there's no guarantee that all cities or towns or nations are communities. But they're really kind of stuck on this item here. They're kind of all talking about this in different ways, and Jane Addams does some really smart writing about this in her Newer Ideals of Peace. That all community is a question of degrees. And where this plays out brilliantly, right? So the term doesn't disappear, the term just gets used in new ways. And I think I have, we can hit the next slide, I think I have this on here. No, I don't, sorry, you have to go back. I thought I had one extra little slide. The best example I found of this that just made me so happy, I stumbled across a textbook that actually was in the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society, but in 1918, right? By 1918, this notion that community could be used to describe a whole range of experiences that may have nothing to do with where you lived and may have nothing to do with people you would ever meet, but could, shows up in a high school history textbook. There's a book published in 1918 called Our Community, Good Citizenship in Cities and Towns, and it is put out by a Philadelphia publishing house for distribution across the country, and so it's like a standard high school history textbook. And it has the first chapter is just called The Community. And yet that singular article, right, by the time the chapter ends, they have said, it starts off sort of saying that a city or a town was a community, but by the end they're saying, oh, but also your family and your neighborhood and your sports teams and your friends and the nation, and it's all good. So the fact that this shows up in high school textbooks suggests that by 1918, right, 1920, this has become an acceptable way, and it's actually being promoted as a way to think about community. Okay, so that's all thrilling, but what the heck does it have to do with St. Paul? And what does it have to do with what I pitched was my interest, which is how everyday folks played a role in this. Because this wasn't, despite what I've just said, a top-down change, right? I don't actually believe that this was a top-down change, that scholars and activists were writing about the change of community and that led people to believe that community was changing. My research has led me to make exactly the opposite finding, that everyday practices in everyday life, that some of which are hallmarks of what people talk about in the progressive era, were the things that were forcing a change that then become reflected in this scholarly argument. So, for me, this reframing of community occurred in everyday cultural practices. And the list, and we'll go to that next list, this list is what I ended up focusing on. So when we think about photographs and architecture and park design and park planning, public festivals and popular fiction, these are actually all like everyday things that if you go to a library and you look on the shelf of history of 1900 to 1920 or progressive era history, you're going to find books on all these kind of topics. And this is everyday stuff, but this is where I think this got remade. So we can shift on to the next. So here we are in St. Paul. Why St. Paul? Oh my goodness, right? I'm not from here. I'm like the Yankee gal who came out here some years ago. I actually struck upon St. Paul as the case study for this project because, for a variety of reasons, primarily to tell this story, you have to tell a Midwestern story, because by 1900 or so, the Middle West was seen as the most American part of America. There's lots of interesting cultural geography scholarship on this, but Scribner's writes a whole article in 1908 that celebrates the Midwest as the most American part of America. It was not old and decrepit like the East Coast, and it wasn't fresh and a little too fresh and young like the West Coast. It was sort of solidly middle-aged, is sort of how they describe it in here. It's kind of great. So you have to start looking at the Midwest. Those cities were changing more and faster than other places. And St. Paul becomes interesting because St. Paul, while it looks, in some ways, I could have picked any number of sort of second-tier Midwestern cities. You think Detroit, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Indianapolis. Like in some ways, they all tell similar stories. But St. Paul had a few things that make it unique. And looking at using a case study to talk about a large-scale U.S. story allows us to get at that texture, right? So there are probably people in this room who actually know more small-scale, detailed history of all of St. Paul history than I do. I don't make a claim to be the person who's the expert on all of St. Paul history, but I think St. Paul is a brilliant way to tell a story about the United States. And everybody and their cousin likes to write about Chicago. And one of the reasons that I wasn't interested in writing about Chicago is that in Chicago, in this period, while you have the kind of diversity I'm talking about in St. Paul, you have a city that's big enough in size and in population that if you want to avoid other people that are not like you, it was slightly easier to do than in St. Paul. In St. Paul, the scale of the city, its geography, its particular economic and industrial mix meant that people had to figure out how they were going or not going to make a life in this new place with all these folks. So what was going on in St. Paul in these 2 years? I think, we'll just leave that one there. I'm sure that I have another one. I'll give you a quick little sense of St. Paul, right? St. Paul, like many, many, many other cities in the Midwest, had an increasing influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and Scandinavia during this time, as well as I mentioned before, the northern migration of Southern Black Americans, which transformed the city, increasing the number of not only non-English speaking residents, but also non-white, non-Protestant residents of this city, which mattered a great deal. In many, many, many cities, including this one, ethnic and racial enclaves developed in very particular ways for the first time, where poverty combining with some nativist tendencies made life challenging, even as opportunities for low-wage, low-skill work remained a draw for folks. In 1900, I'm going to give you a lot of data, so for those of you who would like data, this is great. The rest of you can just wait till the next part. But in 1900, St. Paul had 160,000 people. They had actually quadrupled, that number had quadrupled to 4 times as many people as 20 years before. So there was already this massive growth, right? It was a city on the make. The economy was marked by finance, trade-related commerce, supported by the railroad, right, and the fortuitous location in the Mississippi, where the Mississippian Great Northern, right, it's a transportation hub. Money in St. Paul is made in a number of enterprises that supported the establishment of cities and towns kind of from here all the way out to the Pacific. Railroads, furs, transportation, lumber, banking, real estate, breweries, dry goods. This is what the city was building itself on. Who was living here in 1900? Well, a lot of second and third generation St. Paulites of German ancestry, a large and growing number of Irish and Irish Americans, who had increasingly political and ecclesiastical clout. Some newly arrived migrants from the South. And then we have James J. Hill, of course, and we'll come back to him a little bit later. In 1900, there already were ethnic enclaves scattered around the edges of the city. There was a working class culture that had already taken shape. Lots and lots of churches of different denominations. but it wasn't a powerhouse like Minneapolis was becoming. And actually, I think that's an asset for trying to understand the city. There aren't a whole lot of cities that were powerhouses in the Midwest like Minneapolis, and actually, for that reason, St. Paul is, again, a more representative story for us. By 1920, 70,000 more people now lived in the city. So in 20 years, 70,000 people, that's huge. Like, that's huge. It had become a solidly democratic town with all the ethnic and racial diversity that was common in Middle Western cities, but with not as much, we'll leave it there, not as much of the explicit or public or very prominent tensions between classes or racial and ethnic groups that had begun to mark some other Midwestern cities. Okay, I'm going to say it's on a scale. I'm not going to say there was zero, which you'll see. Grand mansions were now all up and down Summit Ave. Lots of new businesses, right? 3M had already emerged by that time. It had relocated here to the city. And the Winter Carnivals of 16 and 17 had indicated that St. Paul's business and city leaders had a vision to promote their city as a prosperous and healthful place to live, visit, and conduct business. And in 1920, Sinclair Lewis's blockbuster novel Main Street is published. And the first 20 pages of that novel take place in St. Paul. And that is a significant fact. The other reason that I'm fascinated by St. Paul, and this is where I'm going to spend a fair amount of my time this evening in detail, after I give you a little highlights tour, is that St. Paul had an African American population that is remarkable in some very important ways, and at the same time is highly representative of African American urban populations across the country. So St. Paul allows us a case study in looking at how race factored into the idea that you could have cities that were imagined communities in which people all felt connected to one another. By 1920, St. Paul, African Americans in St. Paul made up 1.5% of the population, which might not sound very large, but is fairly representative of populations of African Americans in urban spaces in the north. Chicago has a slightly higher percentage, but not much more. So that's actually not an insignificant number. More importantly, St. Paul was home to a substantial and stable middle-class black population, which included national figures such as John Q. Adams, who was editor of The Appeal, one of the most influential black newspapers in the nation, and Frederick McGee, who was the first black attorney west of the Mississippi River and a key figure in the founding and the creation of the NAACP. In this era, Minnesota twice strengthened its civil rights legislation. In 1902, the city hosted the National Afro-American Council meeting attended by, and this list is quite something, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, William Monroe Trotter, and W.E.B. Du Bois, among a bunch of other people. Culturally and politically, the black population of St. Paul seemed to have advantages unfamiliar to other African Americans in the urban north, and therefore they might have seemed to be in a position to be accepted into the imagined community of this city, and yet race-based discrimination was real and it was present. St. Paul's white population had a history of discrimination and intimidation that persisted into the 20th century. And despite the facade of a colorless St. Paul, African American residents and their cultural productions also powerfully shaped the renegotiation of community here and really tell us something about how this plays out elsewhere. So we can switch to the next slide. And the book itself starts off talking about this novel. If anybody knows this novel, you know it's 400-ish pages that most people talk about as being a critique of small town life. There's a protagonist who spends 380 of the 400 pages complaining about how miserable it is to live in Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, where everybody's in your business all the time and you can't have an original thought and it's petty misery, etc., etc., etc. What very, very many people don't know is that the protagonist, Carol Kennicott, while she's in Gopher Prairie, just longs to get back to where she came from. And where she came from was St. Paul. And the book starts there. And what's wonderful about this book is that Lewis sets up these two cities in this sort of symbolic opposition but, and this is like the best line in all of his many, I think the entire novel, I love this line, she longed to go back to the generous indifference of the city. Oh, what a wonderful turn of phrase, right? Like you all hope you can come up with that someday, right? The generous indifference of the city. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, what it meant, when we look at what her life was like in those first 20 pages, as a young, college-educated young woman who has a job and a life, she loved the fact that in St. Paul, she could simultaneously spend her life hanging out with the people she liked, people who were very much like her, having dinner parties, hanging out with her friends. I mean, it sounds very modern in all these ways. And yet she could also imagine herself to be connected and linked through time and space to all the other inhabitants of this wonderful city. And the city's generosity was that nobody much got in her business that she didn't want them to. She was in control of who was part of her connection of people that she felt cared about, and who she cared about, and who she felt cared about her. So when you look at this novel, the fact that it sold, right, it was the first American blockbuster. It sold 180,000 copies in the first 6 months of publication, which suggests not only were the people reading this, there's got to be something resonating more than just that everyone hates small towns, right? I really think that what this is speaking to is that the readership for that novel is a readership that looks very much like the demographics of its protagonist, right? Educated, white, native-born Americans who actually do, both in the novel and in real life, have the privilege of simultaneously seeing themselves being connected to the city writ large, and yet can kind of make their way in the world picking and choosing who they want to be friends with, and that's a really nice place to be. That's a privilege that the closer you were to positions of power and authority, which largely means being white and being educated and English-speaking and native-born, you have that opportunity. And there's a really wonderful, I do a pretty close reading of it in the book, there's a really wonderful scene where she and her husband-to-be go tramping across the High Bridge to Mendota, and there's this fascinating sort of articulation of what she sees and how she imagines herself in the grand sweep of the city. So if you're somebody who's read the novel before, but you never thought about the first 20 pages, the good thing is you only have to read the first 20 pages. You don't have to read the other 380. She just really hates Gopher Prairie. So, I'm fascinated by that, and I think it's an interest. So I opened the book that way to get us to think about, if this is where the country, what the country is thinking about in 1920. Okay, what's going on? So, sorry, I think I just lost a. Did I just lose a page? Nope, I didn't lose a page. Okay, well, we can flip to the next one here. So, getting away from fictional St. Paulites, and Sinclair lived in St. Paul, albeit for periods of time, so also there's that. But if we get away from fictional St. Paul to actual St. Paul, our turn-of-the-century St. Paulites lived in a city where the tangible yield and the reminders of these affinity and demographic-based divisions or connections, right, were everywhere all around them. The built world, right, we tend to not think much about houses and such, but environments, right, our built environment, these are intentional reflections of ideas and practices and ways of being. They also mark us on the landscape. They usually are signaling something to somebody about who we think we are, who we think we want to be, right? And so the elements of the built environment function to create and maintain both distinctions between people in the city and also to encourage, in some cases, narrower connections than the city writ large, right? So architecture, whether it was residential, civic, or ecclesiastical, so church buildings, civic buildings, and houses, personal houses, those are the three things I talk about, they worked as a visible reminder of both the social and economic limits and communions of a city, even as well-intentioned individuals and groups attempted to employ the same kind of brick and mortar building to tell another story, one of civic unity. And I've just put a bunch of pictures up here. Here in the very middle there is the Hill Mansion, right? So if you think about how this plays out, why does architecture matter? If you've driven up and down Summit Avenue ever, right? on Summit Ave between 1900 and 1920, right? You've got this full suite of unique architect-designed homes in which these families are marking themselves as part of the elite, and they are also in many cases, including the Hills, using their homes here to give a nod back to their connection to the well-to-do in places like New York and Boston, right? So they're doing this broadening of the idea of community, right? I'm connected to people who share my class status and my sort of financial position and my business acumen. And also here within the city, all of us on this street are kind of connected, right? More so than we might be connected to you who live at the bottom of our hill. If you move further on west of the city, you get to places that look in early 1900 that look a fair amount like this here. With this come back to this house later, the house is on, totally blanked, Lincoln. It's 1033 Lincoln, where you've got a new middle class that's burgeoning, and you've got what ends up being a section of the city built in very similar housing styles. They're sort of not quite pattern book style houses, but a lot of similarities that are being built out there relatively uniformly, marking their newness. Dayton's Bluff is a section of the city at this point in time where there was quite a bit of mixed architectural styles going on that actually reflected the fact that that part of the city had more sort of flexibility in how people understood themselves as being able to live networked with folks around them. And Sweet Hollow, which is in the upper right, becomes an exemplar for our purposes of parts of the city where the combination of, where you have homes that are marked by the combination of poverty and ethnic sort of unity or enclaves. Over time, in the East Side, and it's just wonderful that we're here, and on the edges of Sweet Hollow, right, where you end up having mostly Italian and Italian Americans living in a way that unites people to one another because of the sameness of their shared living experience, but at the same time separates them from the rest of the city, right? And then you've got church architecture. So, right, the city's churches in this period of time did quite a bit of work to remind St. Paulites of the presence of some alternatives to either class or race-based divisions that other elements of the built environment might have suggested. The sheer number of churches in the city, and there were, I actually don't have the number on the tip of my head, but the number was immense. And in that sheer number of churches, you end up having a little bit of a tempering of religion's ability to completely transcend these other senses of community. The Catholic Church in particular in St. Paul, which I write about, the Catholic Church both as the institution and the Catholic Church in the cathedral, are a particularly interesting story unto themselves, right? The building in this particular year is a building of Catholic churches, tell the story of how communicants worshipped often with people who looked, sounded, and shared class affiliations and attributes just like them. Right? John Ireland, who was Archbishop at the time, simultaneously in these years is working to erect the cathedral building to send a message to mirror in scale and scope, or scale and sort of prominence on the landscape, the Capitol building, which is being built at the same time, which is down there on the lower right, right? And projecting a message of Catholic universalism, while he is simultaneously encouraging and promoting and supporting the creation of ethnic parishes throughout the city for individual groups of immigrants and or people of color to worship separate from the cathedral parish, right? So, and finally, there isn't a picture of it up here, but in these years, the city auditorium was built. That building no longer exists, but this grand city auditorium was built in 1907 with the intent to provide a space for everyone in the city to participate in big public events, but it was followed quite quickly by the creation of Union Hall, which was funded and was for the use of African Americans in both of the Twin Cities. So if we switch to the next slide here, we have a little park story to tell, right? And in a lot of what happens in this period of time in American history is people are excited about parks. lots of park building everywhere in the country. And there's two types of parks that people are building. And both of those types of parks are being built out here in St. Paul. One is the growth of the large sort of pleasure ground park, the park that's to unite all the people. So here, for example, Como and Phelan are kind of finished in this period. And if you read through, I have read 2 decades worth of park board records, which is just it's actually very fascinating, but like the debates over which trees are going to be planted in which, corner of which acre of the park. But you had a park board and a city that was interested in building these grand parks very intentionally with the goal to provide recreation for all the people and actually to bring people together from across the city in these places. And when the streetcar lines finally extend their way to Como and to Phelan, the possibility for that is pretty high. But what ends up happening in people's real everyday use of those parks is that people went to those parks and they actually spent time with the same types of people that they were spending time with when they weren't at the parks. So your church ladies group might plan a picnic, and so you're not having the picnic at the church. All your church lady friends just go to the park, and now you're having a picnic at the park. And so you are now in a space where in theory you are communing with all these other people across the city, but really you're not. Also, people are coming from other cities, particularly from Minneapolis, because the streetcars are now connecting people in Minneapolis. So you never know if those parks are building civic unity or they're just new places to recreate your the other ways that people are finding opportunities to build those networks of support. Okay? And by the late 19-teens, the park board decides we now need to get on the playground movement. It's a national movement to create recreational spaces for children, largely in neighborhoods. And so again, the park board is very intentional about wanting to have parks and recreation spaces in all the neighborhoods of the city. It's a great intent. Some of the unintended consequences are that because the city itself was already divided architecturally, ethnically, by class reasons into different groups, when you start putting local neighborhood playgrounds and parks in, and then you do things like, which I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, we had this as well, where your neighborhood park in the summer would have like the baseball team that competed against the other neighborhood park somewhere across the city, and that's what they were doing. You end up creating, right, this sense that your neighborhood and your area and the people that you live around are actually your most intentional community, and you maybe don't feel that kind of unity across the city. So I want to do a little bit of talking about race, and you can flip to the next slide here. And I want to do this first by talking about family photographs. So all of us take photographs in some way. Now we just save them all on our phones, and God only knows what will happen to them, right? But photography, especially the simple snap camera, was a brand new thing by 1900. So prior to 1900, if you wanted a photo, you had to go sit, somebody else had to take your photo, you sat there, long exposures. Kodak comes up with the Brownie camera just about this time, and now there's, on some extent, a democratizing of the ability to take photographs. You could get your little camera, you could walk anywhere you wanted, you could take, the snapshot becomes a thing, right? And in fact, it's such a thing that in Sinclair Lewis's novel, Main Street, there's 2 key points in the novel where actually photographs are used as reference points for the protagonist to talk about who she imagines being part, or she doesn't want to have be part of her world, okay? So it's like it even makes it into the novel. But cameras were everywhere in St. Paul, as they were in every other city, right? Everyday Americans are snapping photographs. There's new reproduction techniques that allow newspapers for the first time by about 1900 to start printing more and more photographs in their newspapers. That had actually been a very expensive and technically complicated thing prior to this. So you start to see an uptick in images being circulated in dailies. And social reformers, who are very active in this period of time, start using the photograph, a la people like Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, to capture images that they want to use to invoke sympathy and empathy from folks to resolve social problems, right? So cameras are everywhere. And we might think, like, what the heck can family photographs tell you about anything having to do with community? Because, right, aren't family photographs just that? They're like family photographs. And I want to take a little moment right now and just give a public shout out to the amazing family. This is the Gardner family. These are images all from one family, the Gardner family. And the matriarch of that family now, whose name is Rosella Limon, who agreed with her family to allow me to not only write about, but actually reproduce personal family-held family photographs in this book in order to be able to talk about African-American self-representation in this moment in time. This is an incredibly rare thing. Very, very few public archives hold intact family photo albums from African-American families for very good reason, which I won't go into right now, but I just wanted to make that clear. But the reason that I find family photographs interesting is that they illuminate the importance of racial and class and neighborhood affiliation in determining the boundaries of intimate community. They also reveal the way in which families use photographs to record or to reinforce or maybe even challenge ideas of networks and where you belong that maybe are coming in messages elsewhere. So family photographs, while they're limited because they generally involve family, they are always, right, there's a lot of really great photo theorists who have shown that they are always constructed, all photographs, particularly family photographs, are constructed within broader, what we call institutional gazes, right? So you are choosing to take pictures of things and framing things in ways that reflect the institutionalization of your lived experience and social norms. So they're incredibly valuable when you're trying to get a sense of some of the most intimate ideas of any group of people. Family collections are supposed to be private. They're intended on these private, self-reflective, right, meditations on community. And so it's often when we find photographs that in a family collection that are outside of the family space or do not just show family images that we get a hint at how people represent themselves. So the Gardner family, I'm going to introduce you to them for a sec here. William Gardner, who's pictured here, and his wife Ida, and their 10 children, who in 1910, right, in 1910 they have 10 children, who range in age between the age of 1 and 22. They live in a modest Victorian-style house at 369 J Street, which is now Gaultier Street, in what was and has become known as the Rondo neighborhood. William Sr. was a custodian at a white club in St. Paul, and his two oldest daughters, Ella and Carrie, who are actually pictured there on the lower left, were employed as a dressmaker and stenographer, respectively, while Ida, the mom, stayed home with her growing family. By 1920, William Sr. was now a waiter at a local restaurant. Ida had given birth to one more child, a daughter named Dorothy, who was now 8. That's little Dorothy. This is little Dorothy when she was a baby. But she was 8 by 1920. And Ella and Carrie had moved out of their parents' homes. And the photograph collection traces their family during this decade of change between 1910 and 1920 and provides this incredibly rare glimpse at the private world, right, a self-constructed private world of an African-American family. The collection as a whole supports Bell Hooks's argument that prior to racial integration, and I'm quoting her, the camera was a central instrument by which blacks could disprove representation created by whites because more than any other image-making tool, the camera offered African Americans disempowered in white culture a way to empower themselves through representation. For Hooks, quote, the camera became in black life a political instrument, a way to resist misrepresentation as well as a means by which alternative images could be produced. So if we look back at these images, we see that a bulk of them focus on the immediate family. William Gardner was the main photographer, although his daughters, we're not quite sure which ones, also took photographs. And they're mostly taking photos of the family in and around their neighborhood, right? 2 boys shoveling snow, apropos of this time of year. His daughter standing in a snowy landscape, apropos of this time of year. It's Minnesota, they're all snow. Christmas, which is on the far left. The children lined up in this sort of classic stair-step model photograph, also just outside their home. And here, this is actually my favorite photograph. This is 3 of the sisters, and it's not clear. I suspect that one of their friends took this photo, but there's a couple of them. And this one in particular, but all of them, right, they reflect a family that is just like comfortable in their space, right? They're like claiming the landscape. There's this sassiness here. I mean, it's like every, 18-year-old young woman, right, snapping photos with friends. And so there's this comfort level and this self-assuredness in this space that is a Black neighborhood, okay? If we flip to the next slide, what we see, I'll just point out a couple of those. This is actually down the street and around the corner at their uncle's house, so it's more family members. But what I want to talk about mostly is that when we see, there's a few rare examples, very, very rare in this entire collection, of either the family outside the Rondo neighborhood or people who are not family members in the photographs. So I will point these 2 out. This one here, and I know this is very bad quality. This is, unfortunately, it's like a scan of a photograph of a whatever. But these are some of the children. They're actually in Como Park. That's the only image that exists in this whole album of them in Como. And you can tell from the background if you compare it to other historic photographs. So there they are at Como. And then here are the 2 youngest boys, Bill and Ralph, sorry. Oh, like I say, everyone is Will here, but he generally went by Bill. In downtown St. Paul, near 8th Street. In these costumes that nobody can figure out why they're wearing the costumes. I've honestly spent like 5 years trying to figure this out. It's like you would think they're Winter Carnival costumes, but there's absolutely no other, like, it's a conjecture to think that. And there's nothing else in the family history that would suggest that they had anything to do with it. Having said that, the reason I point these both out is that in these 2 instances, we are well aware, right? The family is positioning themselves in parts of the city that is not the Rondo neighborhood, right? They're sort of claiming that space as their own to some extent. But if you look at the body language, right, the framing in these 2, and these are really like the only 2, these are not comfortable spaces. They're not comfortable spaces. I mean, these children are doing the sort of lineup as they did outside their family home, but if you actually look at the children's faces, and a better version than this one that you can see here, like they're in the space, but they're not of the space. And here, the 2 boys are in the space, but they're even if we look at how it's framed, it's, right, they're kind of floating in that landscape. Like they're actually literally not even so totally grounded, right? The white of their outfits and against the backdrop. It's awkward, and it looks very, very different than how they are in all the other images, all of them. So that is interesting to me. Then you have these 3 photographs, 1, 2, 3, there's a couple others of these, where you see people that are not members of the family. This is Carrie Gardner right here. This is a confirmation photo at St. Peter Claver Church. The family was very, very, they were a central, historically, deeply embedded family in St. Peter Claver's Church. Rosella Limon, who granted me these things, is still an active member at St. Peter Claver. And you see here that Carrie is the only, appears, and really, I mean, historically it's proven, is the only person of color, right, in this. These are all white children. That neighborhood and that parish was actually quite racially diverse because there were a lot of folks who were newly arrived European immigrants who were renting homes or apartments in the neighborhood and belonged to that parish because that parish was there. And so while the Catholic Church seems to have created an opportunity for people to imagine themselves in this ecclesiastical world as being part of people who were outside their racial identifying group, none of, like literally there are no other photos that suggest that any of these children or their outside of the Rondo neighborhood are trying to claim some of that space back. The scarcity of it raises questions for me, and I really, really cannot get beyond the fact that this family would have known full well that while there were civil rights laws in this state, 1899, there was a re-upping of a civil rights law that had been put into effect a few years prior. There also had been an attempted lynching of 2 black men by a white mob near the Capitol building in the years just prior to this. There was, in theory, not supposed to be any discrimination or prejudice in this city, and yet the newspapers are full, particularly black newspapers, are full of account after account after account of people being kicked out of eating and drinking establishments, not being able to find accommodations. So, you know, you can go to Como Park, but I do wonder what you're doing when you're at Como Park and how comfortable you feel there. And we can flip, I'm gonna not gonna do a full run of this next set of slides, you can go to the next one. I just wanna compare this briefly for you. Same exact period of time, another family living 3 miles away, pretty much the same ages as the Dunn, this is the Dunn family, as the Gardners. This is a family that has moved into that 1033 Lincoln house, up and coming young insurance salesman. And their images in their photo album, so I have these paired albums, that's just brilliant, right? It was brilliant that I was able to look at them. I'm not brilliant, it was just brilliant that I had access to them. And they are doing, in some ways, the very same thing, right? This guy's he fancies himself a pictorialist. He's like all part of the camera club of St. Paul, and so he's got not snapshots, but like he's got his own dark room, he's doing his own thing. He's really into the soft focus stuff. He's kind of very lovely, but there is a lot of those. You know, and so he is capturing his wife with their baby, and then the wife with another baby, and then the 2 little boys together, and right? So he's showing his growing family, and he is doing the same thing. There's all these outdoor shots that are sort of claiming the space in that neighborhood as houses are being built up. He has access, right? He works in downtown St. Paul, but really where he's connected is this place that is now being populated by people that are these white, young professionals that are in this new part of the city. He also does a whole lot of claiming. There's actually also paired garden shots here, but there's a whole lot of actually plowing of the land. It's this very frontier thing that I find fascinating, but he's got lots of photos of his boys plowing the land. And then like pictures of his wife picking the vegetables, but boys are always plowing. And this is actually a double lot. I mean, just for fun, you should drive down Lincoln someday. It's a double lot, and it actually still is a double lot, and you can actually see exactly where this all would have been. It's kind of fun. But in his photo album, there's 2 photos. There's only 2 photos, and this is like albums and albums and albums, he did this for years, that show anything that's not that. And it's 2 photos of what was the Oxford skating rink, which was this skating rink that's sort of at the hollow. There's a school near there now. Walking distance from their house. He was one of the organizing members. This is a private rink, right? So he has put this 2 photographs in where you can read private rink very, very clearly. And it was a rink that, and this is actually during a carnival, because these little kids have these carnival costumes on, but you had to be a member to skate there, right? And the people who were members, if you look at the membership lists, are all people that live within about a 10-minute walk of there, who are also all people who have sort of the same class and professional position. So this is the thing that's not his neighbor, that's not his family, that he clearly has put in his family album. I mean, think about if you've got a family album and you're putting things that aren't your family in there, that says something about how important they are to you, right? This is important to him. And what's important to him is, right, this sense of connection with other people that are like them in these very particular class and race-based ways. So if we move on, in the book I also talk about social reform photography and I talk about newspaper photography. But I want to end up today talking with you about the Winter Carnival, because I had no idea when I first moved to St. Paul that the Winter Carnival was such a thing, and it's a thing for years years, I've tried to follow the clues. Like I look them up online, trying to find the medallion, even though we don't live here. We like try to figure them out, never. Pierce Butler Boulevard, that was like one I got one year. So the Winter Carnival, for those who don't know, right, the Winter Carnival started, there were a couple of them in the 1880s. They then get revived in the 1880s, 1890s. Famously, F. Scott Fitzgerald either heard about or saw, depends on who you talk to, one of them. It becomes the inspiration for his short story, The Ice Palace. It's a whole other literary history that I'm not here to talk about right now. But 1916, Lewis Hill, son of James J. Hill, decides, he and other leading industrialists and business owners are like, you know what, we're gonna get that Winter Carnival thing back up and running. That was a good thing. And we're gonna do it for a very, very particular reason. And I wanna get back to this idea of community for a second, because it was in this moment, right, in the face of a city where people were experiencing and creating all these different ways of understanding community. At the end of the 19-teens, right, that these political and business leaders set about staging these two carnivals. Each of them was over a week long. Both of them had nationwide publicity and tons of funding. And they were critical because they reflect the increasing fixedness of this more complex understanding of community created by and reflected in these kind of cultural practices, right? Public festivals like this were becoming very, very popular at this time. And so, it's replicated across the country. Not quite on this scale, but you see these things in many places. So why do they do this? Well, they have two grand ideas. They are simultaneously, in their own writing, simultaneously in 1916, they are going to celebrate their wish. They had this wish to unite the whole city. Right, that they were going to throw this and it was going to just bring everybody in the city all together. There happened to be a fairly tension-ridden growing division tied to labor unrest in the city at the time, and they thought this would be a great way to get all those laborers to stop, fighting for better pay and stuff like that, and rather just rally around being St. Paulites. Okay, but they also at the same time wanted to show off the city's attributes to their counterparts across the nation and celebrate St. Paul and try to get investment and money and tourism and 1,000 other things. So the duality of their intent, right, reveals the impossibility of stemming the tide of this notion of community being everything and then some. Because they were reflecting the fact that they, the leaders, felt connected to these other people who shared their lived experience across the country, and yet they also believed that St. Paul as a city could be united. So this idea that community could be imaginatively understood to be a municipality, even if you experientially lived your life where your community was really a much narrower group of people. And while they tried to do this, right, they tried to promote their vision of St. Paul as a cohesive place, the events of the carnivals illustrated that the alternative experiences of community, not like the city is a community, it's those alternative experiences, those had actually begun to reign supreme. That's what comes out of these. So if we flip this, they commission a song. Hail, hail, the gang's all here. Come to the carnival at Old St. Paul, right there. Hail, hail, the gang's all here, the people one and all. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, the people who came were not necessarily all, right? That's kind of what this shows. So 3 key takeaways from the carnivals. One was the ways in which the rhetoric of a united geographic location did not mean that division had been erased. Number 2, these carnivals highlighted the persistence of this imagined place-based community in the middle of an event that was marked notably by the ways in which some local residents were actually excluded, while others from very, very, very far outside the city limit were brought into the fold. And third, the carnival solidified what had become increasingly apparent, that regardless of your residential status, membership in the imagined community of St. Paul was tied to your position vis-a-vis the white middle class and its particular reverence for the powers of the market. And I won't go into the economic history here, but I actually do kind of dive into economic history in the book. So if you flip this, I've got just 3 examples here for you. We can flip to that. So one of the issues that emerged of this was the cost of the carnivals. In order to participate in these carnivals, you needed a button. The buttons cost $1 a piece. According to, if you go on the inflation calculator that the Fed runs, $1 in 1917 is the equivalent of about $20 to $25, depending on exactly the number. So $25 to $25 for a button. If you are a day laborer, you're not buying the button, okay? The average worker salary in manufacturing in 1916, according to the Federal Reserve, was $20 to $25 a week. So you're talking about a week's salary to buy a button. That is not all. All are not invited, if that's what you needed, okay? In order, there were tons and tons of parades, all these parades. In order to be in a parade, you either had to have a job at a company that was going to provide you with a costume to march in the parade, and not, those like the big companies did that, not all of them, or you had to buy one yourself. The cost of a carnival costume was $10 in 1917. Again, in 1916 and 1917, your worker's salary, so the cost was $10 in 1917 money, which is close to $200, right? Again, not open to all. And there were slides, and so people wrote in and complained about the cost. And the people who ran the carnival said, no, really, it's everybody can do that. No, we can't. And then you have, and this is, I should really make a nicer picture, but you get the idea. I'm going to just point out a couple things. There's some little, you can't quite see them so well here, but these are some little stars here. These reflect where the slides were. There were these great carnival slides. If you look, there's one here that you can't, it's a little faded out. Those slides, which were the big attraction, are located in parts of the city that were easily accessible to people who lived and worked in the business core, and people who lived in this wealthy, this is Summit Avenue. Oh, sorry, that's not true at all, that's Rondo. They're over here, this is Summit Avenue. If you think about the geography of St. Paul, and you think about how you have to get from one place to another, if you're living over on the east side, you're over here, you're not walking to the slides. You're just not. Frankly, if you're in Rondo, while you can actually get to the slides, there's a whole set of other reasons why you're not there, okay? And so the placement and the cost start to tell us how it is that people who are in charge of things like community celebrations are sending messages about who's part of the community by virtue of practices that on the surface seem like, oh, I don't know, it's just where they put the slides. They just put them because they put them there. I don't know. Why are we overthinking it, right? So they're not equitably arranged. There's cost for all this stuff. They're also at the same time actively recruiting to get people to come from all over the country. So you might live in Sweet Hollow and never participate in any of these carnivals because you can't afford to. But if you lived in Boston and you got a train ticket out here, there were literally welcome wagons and welcome teams hanging out at the train station welcoming you. And there was a whole initiative in the city for people who had extra rooms in their homes to open up their homes to have out-of-town visitors. There were banquets thrown for out-of-town visitors. Lewis Hill is riding a horse around town, meeting dignitaries as they arrive. Like, it's a whole scene. The welcome wagon is thrown out, the red carpet. Like, if you are from somewhere else, come on over. They invite President Wilson to come. He declined. He was otherwise occupied. Outing Magazine is like doing all these articles. They make a motion picture, and they are sending this. It went as far as the Pacific Coast. It made it into Europe. So they're sending out flyers, and they're sending out this film, and oh my goodness, so much money put into celebrating this. But if you were black in St. Paul, you might not have been so excited about this. And we can flip, I have a blank slide here just because I'm going to give you a heads up. There's a slide coming that shows people in Klan hoods, because that was in the public newspaper, and those people rode around the city during the carnival. So I'm going to ask you to push it. It is what it is. This was in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, okay? And if you were African American during the 1960s 1916 and 1917 carnivals, not only do you not see anyone really in a position of authority or power or prestige involved in the carnival who looks like you, but in 1917, you have two things happen. One is you have four men, 1, 2, 3, 4, who appeared in, these are newspaper reproductions, who were identified only as attendants or servants to the king, who followed the king around throughout the duration of the carnival in 1917, and were photographed by a professional camera company that was making all these still shots to promote this. So these were actually photos taken in advance of the carnival to send out across the country. So if your image of who is black in St. Paul participating in the carnival, this is the image in advance. And I have spent years trying to figure out who these men were. There's literally, I figured maybe they even got paid, so I've gone through all the records, all the actual receipts of all the contractors who were paid. There's like no indication who they are. And then, nothing is as dramatic as what happened on the last day of the carnival in 1917, which is that the largest, grandest parade that was staged during the 1917 carnival was the one staged on the last full day, February 2nd, when nearly 1,000 cars snaked through the city's business district, even though it was below freezing. The tremendous scale of the event owed a ton to the fact that many of the hundreds of those cars were driven by Minneapolis-based auto dealers who had crossed the Mississippi River to join the parade in a declaration of support for their fellow business leaders, and as a gambit to try to boost attendance at their upcoming auto show, which was the next week. Both the St. Paul-based carnival organizers and the Minneapolis businessmen deemed this the greatest of all the auto parades, and they deemed it an unqualified success. What stands out about it is that the men from Minneapolis, these auto dealers, rode in their cars and mingled with revelers throughout the afternoon, dressed like that. And they came dressed in those outfits, which the St. Paul press called, quote, the white hooded robes such as were worn by the Ku Klux Klan. And that's actually in this article, the article that goes with this. That description, everybody knew this was happening. This wasn't a surprise, because that description was in this article, which ran 2 weeks prior to the carnival, to tell everyone that there was going to be a car parade, and also then the following week you should go to the auto show in Minneapolis because we are trying to cross-pollinate our business enterprises here, okay? And the celebratory headline up there reads, Minneapolis Ku Klux Klansmen coming in force. The hooded crowd of men and women dramatically highlighted the apparent embrace of non-resident economic partners in the city's festival and the exclusion of the city's African-American population. The Klan was making a comeback by 1917. 1915 is when Birth of a Nation is released. By 1920, the Klan is here in St. Paul for real.